what's up, y'all? This is Michael Franti here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Stay Human podcast presented by Gibson Guitars. And I am super excited to talk to this person because he's a multifaceted entrepreneur, investor, and philanthropist. His early career was at Apple, and then he went on to work for Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook as employee number 29. Imagine that. I mean, how many employees does Facebook have now? And he co-created the Facebook platform and Facebook Connect. And then he built his own social media platform called Path, which he's since sold, and founded a venture capital firm called Slow Ventures. He's currently co-founder and chairman of Sunrise, a foundation whose mission is to cure depression, reduce suffering, and understand the brain. He serves as the co-owner and board member of Dwell, the award-winning, category-defining digital media and magazine company serving the global community of architecture and design. And he also serves as the chairman of the Esalen Institute, which is the leading center for exploring and realizing human potential through experience, education, and research, which is located in Big Sur. I love it. I've been there many times over many decades. And he's also a father, a yogi, a skier, a mountain biker, and just overall great human. So please welcome to the Stay Human podcast, Dave Morin. How you doing, Dave?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Michael. It's so wonderful to be here.
I'm stoked to have you here because your work and your life, your career has touched on so many of the things that are so important today. You know, when we talk about social media, when we talk about health and wellness, when we talk about, you know, philanthropy, entrepreneurship, just where people's hearts and minds are today. And when I met you, you know, in this conversation a few minutes ago, the first thing you said to me to describe yourself was that you're a father. And I really resonate with that because I'm also dad of three sons. And as I go through my life, I'm always comparing where I'm at with parenting my kids to how it felt for me when I was their age, you know? So I want to talk to you about that, you know, just as a dad. First of all, how many kids do you have and what age are they?
I have two kids, and they are 4.5 and 6, two boys.
Okay. Awesome. Do you recall your life at that age? What was life like for you at 4.5 and 6?
Well, it's funny that you bring up this context first because I feel really grateful right now because I'm sitting in Montana, which in my hometown of Helena, Montana. And I just actually walked out of dinner with my parents and my sister and their kids and my kids. And we actually talked about this question.
Oh, nice.
for most of dinner.
So you're well prepped.
Yeah, it was a funny thing, you know, and we were talking about the question that you asked, like, you know, and I do this a lot too. I, you know, especially when I'm here, right? It's hard to be in your hometown and not experience ghosts, or not ghosts. I think of it as like a memory palace. You kind of run into experiences you had, and then you're with your kid and now they're doing it. And it sort of causes this collapsing of time and space. And then you, like you said, you kind of have this experience of being a father now. And here you are with your son or your child. And it's a wild thing. And, you know, I think what we were talking about at dinner a lot is how do you parent and sort of enable your kids to become themselves and not try to influence it too much with your own insecurities or your own ideas of what you liked. You know, they're going to like different things. And one of the things I feel really grateful for is my mother put this poem in my bathroom, my childhood bathroom.
Yeah.
And she had written it in cursive. And it was a poem from the book, The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. And it was called On Children. And the opening line is, "Your children are not your children. They're the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, not from you." And I think goes on to say, like, their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit even in your dreams. And I always loved looking at that as a kid. And it's also kind of now become a big part of my own parenting philosophy in terms of how to stay out of the way.
Contrast that by the poem in my bathroom from my mom, which was, "If you sprinkle when you tinkle, be a sweetie and wipe the seedy." So were your
planting the seeds for lyrical genius?
Yeah. So were your parents like into philosophy and stuff? Did you have other brothers and sisters when you were growing up? And also, what did they do for a living? What was your house like?
Yeah, I had one sister, and then I had two stepbrothers and two stepsisters. And they were, though, my stepbrothers and sisters were 10 years older minimum. And so there was a big gap.
Yeah.
My mom was a pathologist. She, helped people in the lab and understand their health. And a lot of my family was doctors and involved in medicine. And then my dad was both a fly fishing guide and kind of a businessman. He was the city manager of my hometown. He ran the FAA in my hometown. He had an MBA, and he was part of the community and whatnot. And then my stepfather was a 8th grade math teacher for 35 years. And so he in hindsight, I don't know how he did it. Teaching 8th graders math for 35 years must have been one of the most difficult things of all time.
That's actually one of the worst memories that I have of my father, because my dad was also a math teacher. He taught like statistics at UC Davis, but I remember being in 7th and 8th grade and him trying to teach me math at home, and the school teaching me like the new math or whatever it was, and whatever, I was in the early 80s. And then I get home and my dad would try to teach me a whole different thing. I didn't understand any of it from either of them. And my dad would be sitting there with a number 2 pencil, banging it on the table. And oh man, it was frustrating. So as in the house that you grew up in, was there the 4 kids there all the time, or were the older ones out? Or
yeah, the older ones were out. So it really was just my sister and I, and she was my younger sister. Because my parents got divorced when I was about 8 years old. And, it was a difficult experience, largely because in retrospect, I didn't understand what was going on at all. And my mom and I and my sister ended up on welfare, actually, for a time period. And that was a very, I think to this day, even when I'm talking about it, it makes my heart hurt. I saw my mom, showing me the paper, like the piece of the documents for being on welfare. And I think I still have fear of that to this day. And I think that was a thing. But yeah, my mom didn't get remarried until I think I was 10 or maybe 12. And by that point in time, all of my step siblings would have been in their 20s. So, it was really my sister and I and my mom and my stepdad for most of my life.
And did you at any point, when your parents divorced, did you feel like you had become the man of the house, or did you feel you had to take on any new responsibility at that age? And it's pretty young at 8.
That's a really interesting question. I hadn't even thought about it through that. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, but I hadn't thought about it through that lens. Maybe. I don't think I thought of it that way, though. I think it was more of a aloneness, if that makes sense. There was like have to fend for myself now. That was more, I think that was more the feeling. I don't know if that's projecting back or not, but that's definitely more the feeling that I remember than. I mean, I remember points in time where I felt very protective, in particular of my sister, and that I had to take care of my sister. But I don't know that I felt that way too much. But
did that feeling? Did that feeling of aloneness stay with you as you grew up and went through, your adolescence and into high school? Did you always carry that with you? Because that's something that really resonates with me. My parents, first of all, I was adopted into a family of, there was 5 kids. I was one of 2 brown kids, and there was 3 white kids in the house. And it was like this, I have one sister who's a lesbian, one brother's a police officer. My mom was a school teacher, and there's 5 kids. And it was this very big family. We had a lot of things, a lot of people there, and a lot of personalities, but I always felt alone. And that feeling of loneliness has followed me. And especially as we got into, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but as we got into like the quarantine time and feeling this sense of isolation again as we're quarantining, even though I'm with my family and the people that I love the most, this like whole idea of loneliness and isolation has come up again in my life. And it's raised my anxiety levels. It's dipped me into depression at times. And so
that makes total sense to me.
I want to know from that time as a kid, like, did you feel that loneliness throughout your childhood?
Yeah, I think it is and has been a driving factor in my life in a lot of ways. And I think it was almost double. It was doubly. It was almost double what it maybe otherwise would have been. There was the fact of divorced parents, this very scary experience of welfare, and that kind of gives you this, am I going to have a home feeling, right? Yeah. And I think to this day I still have that fear. There's like this fear of no matter what I do or what I work on or what creative project or success in any whatever the vector it might be, there's this kind of fundamental fear. My wife and I joke, and we put it in our vows actually, tell cardboard boxes, and I think that says it, right? There's this sort of fear that if that happens, and so I think that happened. And I think that loneliness followed me. And I think it was doubly because I also felt very different from other kids as a kid. And it was right around that same time period. I was in 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. And I now understand it a little bit better than I did back then. But, I always felt like an other in school. And I think it was largely because I had a somewhat different brain, which I now understand a lot better through even a lot of the research stuff I've done the last few years, but I didn't know that at the time. And I just felt different than the other kids. And that wasn't always the best thing on the playground. And that's been a persistent thing. I think, this loneliness, and we could get into the pandemic, but I definitely reflect the same thing. I've been through these waves where I'll be fine. And then, you're still surrounded by family and all this. There's a lot of great that's come from all of this, but the lonely times have been really lonely.
Yeah. So then you're going through high school. At what point did you start to find like this, I guess, for lack of a better word, ambition? Like, maybe there's something that I want to do in the world. Maybe there's ideas that I have that I could bring to life. Did that come to you at all when you're in high school, or is it later on? Or
there was this one. There were 2 things. I was really lucky in that my grandfather, who was my mom's dad, was this really interesting character. He was a doctor. He grew up on the East Coast. His family is very interesting. It was like this East Coast family. The fact that he ended up in Montana doesn't make any sense if you hear his life story. But he his like ancestors came over on the Mayflower, and like,
Wow.
it's like this crazy East Coast story. But then he went into the military in World War II and learned how to be a doctor that jumps out of airplanes. And so he got stationed in the West to try to save people who were dying in the wilderness, because he was a guy who could jump out of airplanes as a doctor. Wow. It's like, that's how my family ended up in Montana. And he was this interesting character who was kind of,
it's just sorry to interrupt, but I could see him. I could see like a Netflix series about this guy.
Yeah, it's interesting. He, if you've ever seen the movie A River Runs Through It,
totally,
Norman McLean and my grandfather were fraternity brothers at Dartmouth.
Okay,
and there's Norman McLean wrote another book called Young Men in Fire, which is about these firemen in Montana that died in this horrible forest fire. And my grandfather actually jumped out of a plane to try to save them in the forest fire. And it's like a whole thing. I think they made it into a TV series or something, but that's as close as it's come.
Okay.
The reason that I bring him up is that I think he gave me a worldly view that you otherwise wouldn't get being a kid living in Montana. And he had a computer at his house, a Macintosh. Okay. And in like 1984, right? 1986. Like when I was 6, 7, 8, he had this computer, and I would go there every day after school. I think because my parents, I kind of felt almost alone, homeless. So I over to my grandfather's house, and I'd play with this computer, and he'd always be on the speakerphone. And he was really involved in ski racing, which is the other answer to your question. He was like the vice president of the International Ski Federation, which is the governing body of World Cup ski racing. And so when you go to his house, I would play with this computer, and then there were Olympic rings everywhere. And so there was this sense of Olympic ambition, right? Yeah. And I would sit there playing with the computer, and he'd be on the phone with like somebody in Europe. And so that was just normal to me, right? And my resolute answer to your question is I fell deeply in love with the internet as soon as it arrived. Like as soon as I was already very good with computers from a very young age. Like I was programming computers. I was teaching classes to my teachers in 4th grade. And I really loved computers and making things with computers. And I would just make things and make games and make, whatever I could make with the computer. I just liked it. And when the internet happened, something happened in my mind. Like it just all made sense to me. And so I kind of started making internet things as soon as like AOL and Prodigy and CompuServe. And I mean, if there's an internet community, IRC, FTP, Gopher, all of the things, I was sort of on it and trying to figure it out. And I had this experience even very young of connecting up to these servers, and these servers were in Hawaii or somewhere else. And you're chatting with somebody in the other part of the world. And this really, I think, kind of colored my worldview, even though I was from this small town in Montana where nobody even knew what that was. And so here's this kid who's very alone at school, but has this almost superpower of like, knowing how to use this internet thing. And I think that was really it.
Wow. So I could see how, just that excitement about the technology, but also how your, feeling of isolation and loneliness, and then feeling of connectedness through these social platforms could really drive you. And at what point did you, I guess, get into, professionally? Did you go to university after high school, or what was your?
I went to school in Boulder. So I went to, the University of Colorado. I really fell in love with Boulder for all the reasons people love Boulder,
Absolutely.
You drive into Boulder and the Flatiron Mountains, and the schools just, the vibe is just different than what you experience anywhere, right? And so I went there, and I was a huge ski racer, so I ended up a really quite top ranked ski racer. I was very good. So Boulder was like this intersection of like the kind of culture that I love. And then skiing and winter mountain culture, right? And I went there, and my freshman year actually was really the year that all of this kind of accelerated. I had by my senior year in high school, all my friends were working in retail jobs and at Taco Bell or whatever.
College jobs.
I had gotten a job working at the Department of Health and Human Services because I knew how to build Oracle databases and do internet stuff. And so I'm like working in the state government, making at the time $10 an hour, but that was $5 more per hour than anybody my age was making. So I thought I was living, right? And by the time I went to college, I had like learned enough about building internet things that I had a website up, and people were calling my dorm room and asking me to build stuff for them on the internet. And so I didn't know anything about business. I didn't know what entrepreneurship was or what a sole proprietorship is or any of this stuff. I just knew there were people calling my dorm room because I had put a website up that I knew how to build internet software. And they were offering me amounts of money to do that people from up here could never even imagine, right? Yeah. Like they were like, I'll pay you $5,000 to build me a website. And I could do that in a weekend. And so, my friends here would be saving for an entire year to buy a car, or something for a couple $1,000s. And here I was able to use this passion and skill set that I had to make creative things on the internet and make really good money. And I had actually chosen to go to Boulder, even though my parents didn't have the money to send me. And my grandfather had actually said he would help. But the year I went down there, he had a heart attack. And I lost all of the funding for my college. So I'd already moved to Boulder, and I lost the funding. And here I am, getting calls to do things. And I didn't know anything about how to build a business. So I just kind of went down to the entrepreneurship school in Boulder at CU and started learning things, And I learned about what a business is and how to build it. And, you can buy really nice computers and you can expense them. Oh, that makes me have better creative tools, right? And there's all this stuff that I started to learn. And I can say I hook, line, and sinker within my freshman year of college, fell completely in love with entrepreneurship because it was just like, it was like freedom. Yeah. And that, you had total control over your own destiny. It wasn't a job, right? It was like this, almost, it was a lifestyle. And
so how did you go back to class after that? Did it make school be tough because you're already doing what you're doing and you've got this passion and now I've got to go take a class that I hate or something, or was school still exciting and engaging to you?
School's always been tough for me. And in hindsight, I now understand it a lot better than I did then. I have some form of ADD, if that's what you want to call what that is. I have a different brain. And there are things I'm extremely good at. And then there are things that if you ask me to do them, I'm going to fail the class. And this is what my transcript looks like. If the class involved rote memorization, I just failed. I just if you asked me to memorize something on Tuesday and do a test on Friday, it just wasn't happening. If you asked me to read quantum physics and explain it to you on Monday, I could do that no problem, right? Do creative things. There are many things that people were like, you're gifted, right? And it was always very difficult for me because, to your exact question, there were classes I would go to and I really loved. But most classes I would go to, they were kind of nothing to me. And I just tried as hard as I could, but it was very frustrating in a lot of ways. And so I mostly ignored them and I focused on learning entrepreneurship. to your point, like I just, all of my time learning about this thing, building internet stuff, you know, it was HTML and CSS, and then it was Flash, and then it was, you know, all these different sort of MP3s and, you know, tons of different things over the years, right? And I just would always, those were the things that fascinated me. And so I just kept creating things on the internet, and in a way it was a practice. I just kept doing it, kept doing it. And that was what really made me the most, I don't know, happy. And I think
did that
you
take
pulled
you
it out
to...
a minute ago. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, you finish.
Yeah, I think there was something really deeply, I really believed in the internet. Like I don't, where we are today with the internet is very different than what it was like back then. And I really believed in the power of connection, and like that the internet was this great equalizer that was like connecting people in a way that was like new and important. And so it almost felt like missionary or something to be a part of it during that time. And I still feel that way, although it's harder these days.
Did that take you to Silicon Valley? Did that like dream and mission take you there, or?
No, actually. When you grow up in Montana, people when you grow up in Montana, people have these license plate holders or these bumper stickers that look like a Forest Service sign, and they say open season. And in Montana, they like change that for like which hunting season it is, and they say Californians, right? On the bumper sticker. And so when you grow up here, California is not a place you move, right? Californians are the people that come and ruin Montana, right? And it never even occurred to me. And I knew it was this place where, like, sort of like if you're into music or film, you move to Hollywood. I knew it was kind of like that, but it wasn't ever a thing. Like I didn't dream of it or anything. Perhaps the only real dream that I ever had was I really loved Apple computer. And I just loved Apple, and Apple's been this persistent thing throughout my whole life. And so there was that, but I still never considered moving there. Right. What ended up happening is I had this friend who was one of my dearest friends at Boulder, who my nickname in college was Dave.com, because everybody knew I was like the internet guy. And she called me. She wasn't a girlfriend or anything. She was just like a really dear, close friend of mine. And she was from Morin. And she called me. She had already moved. We'd all graduated. I had stayed her back in Boulder for a little bit. And she called and said, "You have to come out to San Francisco. It is where you belong."
Yeah.
I just know it in my bones. Like, and you probably belong in Morin, but we're all living in San Francisco, so you need to come check it out. And so I just said yes. And, you know, that was, I went, and it was almost the same as Boulder. When I first drove up the hill from, you know, over into the city of San Francisco, and it's like all the buildings are like white and pastel colored. And it was the biggest city I'd ever seen at the time. And I remember having this like fear, like, where have I gone? Like, where am I? Like, this is so overwhelmingly huge, which is kind of funny in hindsight now that I've seen like Jakarta. But anyway, I went and I saw it, and I did fall in love. And so I decided to move out there without a job. And I figured that, you know, at that point I was thinking, I'm an internet entrepreneur. This is where all my people are. So I must be able to figure it out. But I didn't have a job, but a few of my friends were moving there. And so I decided to go with them. And so that was how I got it. That was how I ended up in Silicon Valley in 2003, which was the world's worst time to move there.
You know, I really want to get into the work that you do with Sunrise, but I don't want to just skip over this chapter of your life because I feel like it's kind of important. But if you could describe, you know, like your work with, you know, Facebook, and, you know, Apple, and how did you how did that lead you eventually to thinking like, man, maybe there's more in the world. I'm really interested in wellness and improving people's lives and finding cure for depression and reduce suffering.
I think that when I got to the Valley, it was this interesting time. You could fit everybody working in the internet in one room, right? Like it was like we were weird in San Francisco at the time, right? Like we're just saying something, right? Like that's really saying something.
In a city of weirdos.
Yeah. I didn't totally understand that until later, but like, there weren't that many of us. We were kind of nerds. Like it was an interesting time. And I got really lucky. I had known this person who worked at Apple and was one of the vice presidents there. His name was John Couch, and he was running the education division at Apple. I started taking him to lunch and taking other people I knew from Apple to lunch, because everybody that had moved to the Bay at that point in time could not get a job. Everybody was working in a bar or somewhere. And so it was just an economic disaster after the dot-com crash. And, it didn't matter if you had internet skills, nobody was hiring. And I really think to some extent I got really lucky. I also really pushed to go to lunch and do this thing. And so in October of the year I moved out there, I ended up this guy, John, saying, come interview. And I did 13 interviews in one day. And I got the job. And so I got to go work at Apple. And it was during right before iTunes and the iPod and, Steve and all this stuff. And we had like 2% market share, right? Like when I got there, we literally couldn't sell the iPod to anyone. And the first thing, nobody remembers this, right? Like we didn't have the iTunes music store. Like, we were doing things like giving iPods away to all the students at Duke so that they would like maybe put their classes on it. There were all these things going on, and I got to work with Steve. I got to work on really interesting projects. And I suppose the most important story to make this chapter shorter is that halfway through working at Apple, I was obsessed and in love with this idea of community on the internet. And I couldn't understand why we weren't doing more to get the students that used Apple computers to communicate with their computers and create community on the internet, because Apple's entire message was about creation, right? I would go into work every day. I would go over to iTunes, hang out, and I'd get to meet awesome musicians, and we'd be working with people on the Pro Tools and on iLife. And that was when we were launching GarageBand and iMovie and all these amazing creation tools, right? But we were doing nothing to enable people to take those things they created with their Mac and put it on the internet. This is a funny thing to even say in hindsight, right?
Yeah.
But Apple had this technology called QuickTime, which at the time was mostly used in the porn industry and by extremely high-end film, right? And so I was like, why don't we create a community on the internet where students can upload what they make with their Mac to QuickTime? And this was before YouTube, right? And so we were working on this, and I was trying to figure out how to get more students involved. And this person that was our Apple rep in Boston pinged me and said, hey, you need to see this Facebook thing. And I happen to have my .edu email address still. And so I logged into it. And the first day I saw it, I was like, this is going to change the world. And the reason why is I went on the Facebook profile, and in the middle of the profile above the fold was the AOL Instant Messenger screen name. And I was transported back to my dorm room freshman year of college and using AOL Instant Messenger, and how all of us used to talk about there's this network in there and we can't find each other. What if you could just find each other inside of this thing? And Facebook was like this thing that made that happen. And I was like, oh my God, this is going to like change everything. And there was MySpace and there was these other ones, but I don't know, there was just something about it. And so I immediately got on a plane and went and met with Mark and Dustin. And I became Facebook's first partner. And so the first group on Facebook, the first social media campaign ever was the Apple group. And I started paying them a subscription fee because, this is kind of ironic in hindsight, they didn't want to do ads. I didn't want to do ads. I was like, I want a community. And so they created this group, and it went from 0 to 500,000 students in like a year. And this had Steve Jobs saying to me, what is this voodoo magic that you know? Like, how did you do this? Like, the biggest database we have is 50,000. You have 500,000 people somewhere like talking about Apple stuff. Like, I don't understand. And so this conversation started between Steve and I, which was like, figure out how to put this magic in Apple products. And so I got kind of the license. Once Steve gives you that license, you can kind of like go around and try to do things. And so that's what ultimately led me to actually going to Facebook, because we were trying to put the Facebook into the operating system. All of these metaphors that we use to do computing are kind of weird. They're like artifacts of the office environment, but really what I'm trying to do always with the computer is interact with another human. Yeah. And so we were trying to do that with Facebook by like pulling the address book out and all these kinds of things. And ultimately, I think I was too young and too much of a hot shot, didn't know how to communicate. And I couldn't get it done really at Apple. And so in the summer of 2006, Dustin Moskovitz, the co-founder of Facebook, he said to me, why don't you build this operating system idea over here? Let's turn Facebook into an operating system. And I was like, whoa. And so I left Apple and went to Facebook, and that's what we did. We took about 9 months and we turned Facebook into an operating system that anybody could build software on top of. And, same story. We launched it. We only had 100 people on it. And by the end of a year, 1 million developers in 180 countries everywhere in the world were building software for it. Everything from games to music apps. I don't know if you remember this app called iLike. They were doing music, and then on and on. And I built a second version of it called Facebook Connect, which still to this day you can use if you've ever logged into anything with your Facebook account or your Instagram account or any of that stuff. That's Facebook Connect. And that, that led to Spotify. I helped make the social features of Spotify using that stuff, and the Peloton bike, you can see who you're racing against, using Facebook Connect. So anywhere that your friends are on the internet was that. And so, I mean, all I say to people, and we can close that chapter, but it kind of was a shot out of a cannon. I think I lived many lifetimes in a very short period of time. We went from almost no employees to 2,000 employees, from 5 million users to 1 billion users. It all happened in 4 years, right? Wow. And it was like I could tell stories about it forever, but it was a crazy time. And that's when I met Johnny.
It really is an incredible history in there. I mean, I'm just salivating here, just hearing you just share even the little bit that you did, knowing that there are so many other stories about that time and the way that it's now affected the world. People are just beginning to sort of look at it and say, with a critical eye, what did all this stuff do, and where has it taken us, and how does it not only affect the world, politically, socially, all these things, but how does it make us feel as people? Yeah. And that's what I love about what it is that you do now. I had Jeff Orlowski on the podcast a few weeks ago, the director. Yeah. The director of Social Dilemma. And we talked about this, like, how does it affect us, the way that we feel as people growing up? Because so many of these things intersect. We like to think of technology as this thing that's, somehow mechanized and it's over there. But at the end of the day, it's like what you said, it's about how people feel, how they connect with one another. And your work today with Sunrise, and dealing with depression and reducing suffering, and at Esalen, being about wellness, not just being a thing that, I ate an organic salad, I went for a run 2 days ago, and I'm taking a yoga class today. It's not just about that. It's about, how do we feel every day? Are we living good lives? Are we showing up? Are we happy? So how does your experience from working at Facebook and creating all these platforms now, how does it inform what you do today?
Yeah, I mean, I left Facebook in 2010, largely, people always ask me, didn't you know, right? And, I know Jeff really well. I know Tristan very well. We at Esalen, we helped a lot with Social Dilemma. I was actually at the first meeting that led to the Social Dilemma. And it's, people always ask me, like, didn't you know, right? Like, didn't you know that this thing was going to impact mental health? And I can say, like, with an extremely straight face, no, we had no idea. And we really, I was lucky. I was in the room where it happened, many of the rooms where it happened, right? And I had come from Apple, where Steve Jobs' vision was this notion of the bicycle for the mind.
Yeah.
That this is a tool that humans without a bicycle are somewhere in the middle of the stack, right? They're like the middle in terms of efficiency of locomotion. It's like the eagle and the cheetah are number one, right? But a human on a bicycle instantly goes to number one. So the difference between us and all other animals in the animal kingdom is that we're tool builders. Mm-hmm. And so the computer was always the bicycle for the mind. And if you had been at Facebook in 2005 to 2010, you would have been in a lot of meetings where there were a lot of extremely passionate people talking about what the world would be like when everyone has a voice, when the publishing industry doesn't control who gets to say what, right? That governments can't control that. That this is a superpower that we're giving, a social superpower, right? And I think that we really believe that. I still believe this is possible. But I think that there were things we didn't see, and I ended up leaving in 2010 largely because there were things that, I mostly felt my work was done on what I came to do. And I also really felt like Facebook was getting bigger and more focused on things that were less about closeness and more about the public, if that makes sense. Like, it was becoming more of a stadium or a town square than your dinner table at home. Mm-hmm. And so to your point about feeling, I started another social network called Path. And on Path, you could only have 150 friends maximum. And the reason is that there's tons of science, mostly done by an anthropologist called Robin Dunbar, that proves that the human brain can only maintain 150 stable, healthy, social connections. Yeah. And so I really wanted to only focus on that. And so I spent 5 years of my life trying to build a new social network that was about quality over quantity, was about your dinner table at home, where you can be vulnerable and share anything that you want with the people who love you and care about you. And you could receive trust and you could share things that you wouldn't share anywhere else. And that the system and the network would create that feeling. And so we did that for 5 years. And it was very successful, actually, in Southeast Asia, of all places. It was successful in Bali, all over South. We were the #1 network in Indonesia, broadly Southeast Asia. Didn't have as much success in the US. And the truth was, it was probably 10 years too early. I think if I had started it today, which might actually still be a good idea. A lot of people have been telling me, Dave, you should remaster that album and re-release it, you know? And I'm actually considering it. But the experience was a difficult one, and it led to the Sunrise, because in that time period, that was also the time period when the internet became a very difficult and very nasty place. And I dealt with a lot of, I'd be interested in your perspective on this, but I dealt with a lot of positive, but I also had a lot of hate and a lot of really difficult sort of, dealing with millions and millions and millions of people and all the different opinions and everything. And if you say one wrong thing and it gets misinterpreted, and, I ended up in a pretty dark place towards the end of it. And to the point where, I did this interview, and actually my PR team had done the interview for me. It's one of those situations where I didn't even really do it. I just signed off on what it said, and I was really busy dealing with some other stuff, which was equally as important. And I ended up really getting attacked on the internet for a year. And people were saying, you should die. You should go back to Montana. You should never, you should have never been allowed in Silicon Valley in the first place. And it was this really difficult experience. And we were just trying to make this thing that was really, we thought, really positive and something that was important for people's close friends and their families. And I had this really difficult experience. He walked off to his car and a bus went by, and the neuron went off in my head, the jump in front of the bus. And I was just okay, I wasn't going to do it, but the fact that it went off in my head was scary enough. And I got home that night and I was crying on the floor at my house. And my wife was like, "Are you okay?" And I finally calmed down, and I was laying in bed reading a book or something. And she comes walking around the corner and she says, "I know you've had the worst day of your life, but maybe this will cheer you up." And she handed me a pregnancy test. And it was positive. And I just literally, you'd probably appreciate this. I had literally just been in Bali. I had done the water ceremony with the water priestess. I went through this experience, and I just looked up and I was like, "Really, dude? This is how you teach this lesson? This is, and I can really trace almost everything from there on out, pretty much that moment. And I really started thinking about things differently. It really changed the way I think about entrepreneurship, about being creative, about how to do that in a way that is sustainable and healthy. And it led to starting Sunrise, and really trying to figure out where does this come from? And I started really working on Sunrise from a very simple place. I had my own experiences with this. Being a creative person, I think anybody who's creative goes through these things where you do something and work turns out okay, and then you have a good period, and then usually there's a period where it's not as good and it's really difficult. Usually when you're not feeling as creative, or you're having trouble making things, and I've always been through that. But then my dad actually has had treatment-resistant depression for pretty much his entire life. And so one of the questions that really started me on this was how, at the time I was 35, and I was just how am I 35 and for 35 years, nothing has changed? And, nothing's helped my dad. It's always been the same. None of the doctors or drugs or any of this stuff. And so that's really where I started, from this very simple place. And with this I call it the master key, getting to work on Facebook means that I could open a lot of doors. And so I started very much on the science side of things. I just started meeting with neuroscientists and psychologists and people you and I know together, that, folks at UCLA and Johns Hopkins. And, very early on, people were like, "Are you studying psychedelics?" And, and all these things that I literally knew nothing about. And, I think I'm the only guy that ever went to Boulder who didn't smoke pot in college, because I grew up I grew up a really serious athlete, and it wasn't my thing, you know? And so
Yeah.
I had to kind of learn about a lot of these things that not only did I not know anything about, but I would say I was heavily stigmatized about, and, you know, kind of wading around in this world of how to deal with mental health and brain health and whatnot is a really interesting thing when you don't know much about it and you're trying to figure it out. So anyway, that's kind of how I went from Facebook into this world of trying to really reduce suffering.
Yeah. You know, we're just about out of time here for this episode, Dave, but I would love to do this again and just go straight into the mental health work that you're doing, because as I kind of mentioned before, the quarantine has brought this up for so many of us. Like, it's for better and for worse, asked all of us to look inside and say, how are we showing up for our lives, our families, our communities, our country, our planet? And then so much of the stimuli that we're getting every day is through our phone and social media and then you throw in politics and social justice and environmental. It's like, it's so overwhelming to just be a thinking human being today. So I would love to have you on to talk about this another episode. I hope we can make that happen. The final question I have for you is the question that I ask everybody at the end of the show. And it's, what does it mean to you to be human? And then how do you stay human? How do you hold on to it?
I think being human is, a lot of people would probably answer that straight out of the gate by saying, being vulnerable, or, being willing to be open and vulnerable. But I've come to think of it more along the lines of compassion. I think that there's this thing about being across from another human and, being able to, I may not be able to be you or anyone that I'm sitting across from. It's very hard for me to be a woman, right? Like, I just can't become that or become a different color or a different brain, right? But I think there is something about trying to look through the other person's eyes, understand that they're probably made up of the same suffering that you are, and that theirs might be different, but can you try at least to increase your awareness to a level where you can feel that and sort of and hold that while you're with them. And I think there's something about being deeply inside of that's human that I think is the answer to the first part. And I think the second part for me, and I would love to do this again. I think there's so much we can talk about. And I didn't even get to talk to you about how much I admire you for everything that you're doing on this front. I mean, I've always loved your music. Your music is a huge part of what I'm about to say in terms of how I stay human. But to me, and not just your music, but your advocacy for this, I mean, it's been very vividly clear. There are people out there that care about this, but then there are people out there who care about this and have the ability to transmit that feeling to other people. And you're one of the few people on the planet that can do this in a way that makes me feel better, when I'm going through it, right? And I think that's a type of compassion which very few have the ability to do. And so for me, the thing that makes me, or I think the way I stay here really has become, and it's become, for me, it's yoga. And that might seem like a simple answer, but it's been something that since I started working on all of this, I was really science centric for the first, I think, because I come from technology. Yeah. But I also grew up deeply spiritual. And I've much more gone to the spiritual side of dealing with this. And I think that I can tell you point blank that if it were not for yoga, I don't know that the pandemic, this time period, would have been the same. I don't think I could have stayed human. I don't think like I could have stayed in it, right? Like the way that I've been able to, without a daily yoga practice. And for some people, that's sitting meditation, right? But for me, it's moving. Like I'm a moving meditator and I've got to move. And I think that that practice and that everyday increasing awareness and kind of learning how to experience myself and how I relate to others and where I'm at on any given day. I think that that's it. And it helps me in all aspects of everything that I do. And I think that's what comes up for me, at least initially.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. This has been really awesome just to hear your story, hear where you came from, hear how your passion for it's always been there for you, man. I don't know if you've known that throughout your whole life, but I see your passion for connection as being like the main source of everything that you've done. And now we need this more than ever. We need to feel that we can be connected in an authentic way. We need to feel like we can connect to our hearts and our spirits and our body and really be able to live happy lives. And that wellness, like as I said before, is more than just eating a salad. It's everything that makes us who we are. And so, man, thanks for being here today. Let's do this again and dive in a little deeper on it. This has been awesome. This has been our chat today with Dave Morin. And thank you, Gibson Guitars, for presenting this show. And we'll see y'all next week on the Stay Human podcast.